Empathy is a more popular concept today than at any point in its history. It's on the lips of neuroscientists and business gurus, political activists and religious leaders. The Dalai Lama has said it's the basis of compassion, and Barack Obama has told us that tackling the empathy deficit is a crucial issue of our time. Now, despite this popularity, we're still narrow in our thinking about empathy. We tend to look at it in terms of relationships between individuals. But I believe that empathy can also be a collective or a mass force that can shift the contours of the social and political landscape. It's actually one of the cornerstones of creating a democratic culture that respects human rights, that creates equality, and that's sensitive to social injustice. Now, before I explain why exactly this is, let me be clear about what I mean by empathy. Empathy is the art of stepping imaginatively into the shoes of another person, understanding their feelings and perspectives, and using that understanding to guide your actions. So empathy has an affective component about mirroring or sharing emotions, but it's more than this. It also has a cognitive component about perspective taking. It involves really stepping into someone else's skin and walking around in it for a while. And it additionally involves using our understanding to inform our behavior. Now, the good news is that the latest neuroscience research shows us that 98% of people have the ability to empathize. But few of us actually draw on our full empathic potential, and we've made even less effort to understand it as a political force that can create more ethical and democratic societies. Yet the idea that we should turn to empathy as a resource for morality and democracy has recently been subject to critique, for instance by the psychologist Paul Bloom, the philosopher Jesse Prince, and the theologian and former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams. The critics tend to make three points about empathy. They raise three problems with it. The first is that empathy is parochial. They point out that we empathize much more easily with people in our own backyards, so we'll help out our family members or neighbors, but ignore the plight of earthquake victims in distant countries. The second critique is that empathy is partial, that we have an empathic bias towards the in-group, to people of similar social, economic or cultural backgrounds to our own. So, for example, white judges might give more lenient sentences to people who share their educational, professional and social backgrounds. Now, the third accusation made against empathy is that it's unclear. This is to say that empathy doesn't help us make tough moral judgments. For example, should we give out charitable donations to a cancer charity or to one that alleviates child poverty? The conclusion that the critics typically reach is that we should be extremely skeptical of empathy and even abandon it when it comes to ethics and politics. Instead, we should rely much more on reason, which is embodied in law and rights. Empathy is depicted by the critics as emotional and subjective, whereas rights are depicted as being rational and objective. As the psychologist Paul Bloom put it in a recent New Yorker article, empathy can pull us in the wrong direction. A reasoned, even counter-empathetic analysis of moral obligation and likely consequences is a better guide to planning the future than the gut wrench of empathy. But I believe that this is a fundamentally mistaken and inaccurate view of the relationship between empathy and reason. It's actually based on a false dichotomy that really misses the big picture. When we step back and look at the historical evidence, empathy and reason work together to create more ethical and democratic societies. The way I think about it is like this. Empathy opens the door of our moral concern, and laws and rights wedge it open. And this is a pattern we see repeated throughout Western history, one that's been noticed actually by a new wave of scholarship, for instance by the historian Lynn Hunt and the psychologist Steven Pinker. Democratic rights, these thinkers point out, have grown out of extending empathy to previously neglected social groups, such as slaves or women, and including them in our vision of a common humanity deserving of equal treatment. Laws and rights, then, have been used to codify and universalize this expansion of our moral universe. A good place to look for the evidence is in the humanitarian revolution of the 18th century, which saw the rise of the first humanitarian organizations to tackle child neglect and improve working conditions, and it was also the era in which civil and political rights and equality were embodied in the American French revolutions. Now, Lynn Hunt argues that the main source of this shift was the so-called reading revolution. The spread of novels and literacy helped educated classes in Europe and North America step into the shoes of previously neglected social groups such as the urban poor or slaves. By reading about them in novels by Rousseau or Richardson, and then in the 19th century discovering Dickens's Oliver Twist or the characters in Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, they started to grasp the reality of their lives and discover unexpected commonalities. The result was to create a new democratic culture that underpinned the rise of human rights. As Hunt put it in her book Inventing Human Rights, in reading, they empathized across traditional social boundaries between nobles and commoners, masters and servants, men and women. Without this learning process, equality could have no deep meaning and in particular, no political consequence. Empathy serves as the foundation of human rights. So it's clear that empathy and rights are intimately intertwined and far from being polar opposites as the critics contend. But it wasn't only the reading revolution that transformed the 18th century. Social movements also used empathic campaigning to expand rights to marginalized groups, as they still do today. A good example of this was the movement against slavery and the slave trade that emerged in Britain in the late 18th century, as I explain in this clip from my video, The Power of Outrospection, produced by the Royal Society of the Arts in London.
In the 1780s in Britain, slavery was an accepted part of society. People felt that the economy was as dependent on slavery as our economy is on oil today. 500,000 African slaves were being worked to death on British plantations in the Caribbean. And nobody thought this could ever be eroded. But in the late 1780s, there was the rise of the world's first great human rights movement. And it was a movement powered by empathy. Its leaders developed a very empathic campaign. The idea they had was to try and get people in Britain to experience or understand, at least, what it was like to be a slave on a slave ship, on a slave plantation. They published oral stories of former slaves talking about what it was like to be sort of whipped until they were lying on the ground. They also ran public meetings where they showed these little instruments which were used to keep slaves' jaws open to force feed them. They organized for former slaves to give talks around Britain about their experiences. And this led to a sort of revolutionary social movement, really. It led to petitions, it led to public protests, it led to the first great fair trade boycott of sugar. Eventually it led to the abolition of the slave trade in 1807 and later slavery itself. What this all led to, or what it really showed, was that empathy could be a collective force.
So the struggle against slavery reveals not just that empathy can emerge on a mass scale, but also how the gut wrench of empathy opens the door of our moral concern for neglected or marginalized groups, while rights and laws then wedge that door open. And it's a story that has been repeated throughout democratic history, in the struggle for women's suffrage and against child labor in the early 20th century, in the civil rights movement in the United States in the 1960s, and in the more recent campaigns for gay rights, indigenous rights, and the rights of disabled people. Without empathy, we might still be living in a world without adequate social protection for children, or any gay rights legislation whatsoever. The reason why we believe all people should be treated equally, and why we enshrine this in laws and rights, is because empathy has made us care about the plight of strangers outside our immediate communities. It's expanded our moral universe. As the cognitive linguist George Lakoff puts it, empathy is at the heart of real rationality because it goes to the heart of our values, which are the basis of our sense of justice. Empathy is the reason that we have the principles of freedom and fairness, which are necessary components of justice. So the critics who try to drive a wedge between empathy and reason are fundamentally mistaken. And just as empathy is not enough in and of itself to secure the legal frameworks to protect and promote democratic rights, neither is reason in itself sufficient. The Nazis used law and reason to argue that Jews were subhuman, and they codified this idea in the Nuremberg laws, which I think reveals what can happen when law is divorced from empathy. Empathy and reason work together and are mutually reinforcing. We need them both. But if empathy is such an important foundation for ethics and democratic culture, what about the criticisms that I mentioned earlier, that empathy is parochial, partial, and unclear? Well, I think we're now in a more informed position to reflect upon them. So the first critique is that empathy is parochial. We mostly care about our nearest and dearests. But we need to understand that proximity is no guarantee of care. We can walk past a homeless person on our street just as we care about the life of an earthquake victim in a distant country when we see them interviewed on television or hear their personal story. The real question is how we give people a human face, how we can give them individuality, whether they are near or distant, so we can understand more about the reality of their lives and expand our moral concern for them, just as the campaigners against slavery in the 18th century made members of the British public care about strangers on the other side of the world. The difficulties of empathizing shouldn't make us abandon it. Instead, we should rise to the challenge. The second critique was that empathy is partial. It makes us biased towards people who are like ourselves. Yes, I agree. We can have empathic in-group biases. But that's precisely why we need to make an effort to escape the boundaries of our peer groups, develop our curiosity about strangers, and engage with and learn about the lives of people whose backgrounds differ from our own. This is exactly what readers of novels were doing in the 18th century, and it's what the writer George Orwell was doing more actively in the 1920s when he lived down and out on the streets of East London, abandoning his life of privilege to spend time with homeless people and beggars and sleep in doss houses, a completely transformative experience that sensitized him to their suffering. Now, the third argument against empathy was that it's unclear. It doesn't give us the moral rules we need to make complex moral decisions. It's certainly true that empathy can't help us deal with every moral dilemma we face. But this is really a straw man, because no moral system, whether based on empathy or reason or virtue or something else, can provide all the answers. The point is that empathy makes us better informed when making moral judgments, so we don't ignore the voices and perspectives of those who are socially marginalized, such as asylum seekers or the unemployed. Empathy helps us recognize that there are no simple cases. For example, you might be convinced of your belief in capital punishment, but if you met someone on death row or heard their story and stepped into their shoes empathically, you might well reconsider your views. Empathy helps us realize that we have to think harder, that there's more complexity than we imagine, that there's no black and white when it comes to the fundamentals of morality. Now, these three critiques, I think, are worth considering, but they're far from conclusive and certainly don't warrant dismissing empathy. Quite the opposite. I think they call on us to actually expand our empathic imaginations. So the question now we're left with is how to create a new generation of empathic citizens who can harness the power of mass empathy to deepen democratic culture. I think the best place to start is with young people, giving them the opportunity to take part in education programs like Roots of Empathy, which has now reached over 500,000 children worldwide, and which can help them switch on and develop their empathic brains. But educating our children is only part of the challenge. We should also support social movements that are attempting to deepen democracy. As the Occupy movement and the Arab Spring revealed, real politics happens between elections through grassroots social action, which influences and affects and impacts on political elites. Empathy is crucial since it raises the moral concerns that fuel public protest against inequality and discrimination, and that can help us tackle problems from global poverty to ecological crisis. It's with this kind of understanding of the power of empathy that we can begin creating a new era of global democratic citizenship, where we break down the toxic barriers between us and them, whether those barriers are being created by political ideologies, national boundaries, or religious, racial, and economic divides, and where we come to recognize that the democratic ideal must also be based on an empathic ideal. You are, therefore, I am.